welcome to this episode of the Two World Podcast. Today, we are going to delve into another episode of the 1990s television show Northern Exposure. This is from season 5 at the beginning of the season. This one's called Three Doctors. But before we jump into that, we would most assuredly like to introduce our two co-hosts. My name is Ken, by the way. And our first co-host to my left on the screen is...
I think that's me, and I am Barney.
It is you. And our other co-host...
I am Jacob.
All right. So we're going to talk about different kinds of doctoring. I think is maybe the most simplistic way I can give an introduction to this. So we hope you'll enjoy this episode and maybe be intrigued enough to visit Amazon Prime or another vehicle to view it.
Yeah, and we have been thinking about a few different episodes that we want to introduce to Jacob and then talk together as a group in general. But we thought, especially with the passing of Graham Greene, then we thought this would be a good episode to talk about today, as he comes back again and reprising his role as shaman. And I think we have talked about an episode where he was on earlier, where he kind of comes to observe Joel's practice. And, he has that poignant observation where he says, Joel, you're bored with your practice because you're boring. And Joel eventually comes around to admit that, you know what, actually, you're kind of right. And Leonard helps him to rekindle his love for medicine. And we see he comes back again in this episode, and this time he does talk with Joel a bit, but he is mostly focused on Ed. And so Ed has an interesting story going on through much of the episode. Shelly has a fun kind of carryover from the finale of season 4. We see a little progress with what's happening then, and then Joel is being doctored by most of the community, as well as he comes down with something that is very perplexing to him. So those are the 3 main stories. I don't know. What do you guys think we should look at first?
Yeah, I would just like to say a couple things about Graham Greene.
Oh, yeah, you're right. Yeah, we should start
passing.
talking
And
about
also
that.
a disclaimer that may be appropriate. The disease we will talk about mostly is glacier dropsy. It is fictional. You will not catch glacier dropsy in your lifetime, but what a great terminology triumph to pick. That's amazing. I'm not a huge Dances with Wolves fan. Seen it and watched Graham Greene's work in that. I look at him though when he's able to do what he did in Northern Exposure and Dances with Wolves, and an old favorite show of mine, the Red Green Show, is just absurd comedy. And Graham Greene was in several of those. He would play a word game, and his profession was he was a professional blower upper of things. And he still had that same basic deadpan delivery that he would use in dramatic roles, and he's hilarious by using, he's I look at him and I think of Morgan Freeman, who can do anything kind of thing, and I really thought Graham was that way as well. So I'm blubbering a bit, but he was really a treasure, and as a shaman in Northern Exposure, perfect casting. Perfect.
Oh, yeah. Oh, for sure. It's great that he was willing to be in that role, and he did just such a great job in that role whenever he was on.
Yep.
Well, I feel like there are so many ways that we could enter this conversation, and the title being Three Doctors, right? Is that our title? I kind of just wonder as we enter the episode, do you have a sense of who the 3 doctors are? do you have a theory? Is it clear to you? I mean, so many people are giving medical advice during this episode, and I'm trying to think, is it, is it Joel? And then we have, is it Leonard? Is that the name of the
Mm-hmm.
medicine man? And then
Mm-hmm.
we have, is it Ed emerging into a medicine man? Or is it Joel's colleague that he calls that he has like a hallucination of talking with at the foot of his bed? Or is it like, who are the three doctors? I would love to know if you have a theory as we get started.
And there's also Neil, who, while playing a minor role, is definitely a doctor from Joel's stomping grounds in New York City. Yeah, good question,
Ah,
Jacob.
yeah.
Barney, what do you how
Yeah,
do you see?
I had a moment of panic when we were getting ready for the show to start because of all the times that I've ever watched these episodes, I hardly ever checked the title. I would just put in the DVD and let it go. And then when I realized, oh, this is called oh, wait a minute, who are the three doctors? And then I thought, okay, well, yeah, Joel and then Leonard. Okay, that's easy. And then I don't know. Then I thought, well, probably Ed. But on the other hand, you could kind of even consider that the people taking care of Joel, taking care of him, are Doctorine and or you could say it was even Marilyn because she's the one who declares him fit at the end. Where I love it. He finally succumbs to. He accepts that glacier dropsy, or I think like at one time, Holling called it an ague or something like that, a word that you'd never see. And, he's like, oh, can I have some more? Joel says, can I have some more tea? And Marilyn's like, get it yourself. But yeah, the third doctor is not so clear because yeah, it could be Dr. Weissman, from New York, Neil Weissman, the virologist who had his pick of places he wanted to work, and I love the line where Joel says, "Don't QID me," when he tries to tell him what he should be doing to take care of this. But
So
Well,
it's, oh, go
yeah.
ahead, Ken, please.
No. Go ahead, Jacob.
I was going to say, I feel like there are a lot of aspects of the show that leave it open for the audience to interpret. And so it's fun to try to speculate, but there is some ambiguity about who
hmm,
the third doctor is. And so maybe it's hard to determine, but thanks for taking time engaging with that. So I know that in our questions in the Google document that Ken, you, and that Barney, you both contributed to, you were kind of starting with Ed and his kind of journey in this episode. So is that an okay way to
yeah,
jump in?
yeah, because the episode starts off with Ed. We see him in a tree in his PJs. And he's calling to Maurice, and Maurice cannot find him anywhere and looks up and sees Ed. Of course, the first question, how did you get there and why are you there? and then Maurice says, get down here. I need a ladder. And then where else does he end up waking up a few different times?
Top of the brick,
Yeah,
top
right.
of the brick of the bar restaurant in Sicily, yeah. And he
Mm.
just kind of peers out over it.
And it's
Yeah.
funny that the first person, is it the first? I think before going to Joel, I think he goes to Chris, doesn't he, for perspective on what's happening. hmm What did you
Yes,
guys?
and the humor, you kind of knew it was coming. Chris, have you ever awakened somewhere and didn't know how you got there? Well, Ed, only about 100 or 200 times.
Uh,
Only Chris.
yeah, and then his kind of reasoning as to why somebody might wake up and not know where they are, or try to repress certain memories.
Yeah, yeah,
You
we forget what we don't want to remember.
Alimony payments, mass murdering. The mind has a way of just forgetting these things, these traumas.
And Ed is so good natured that he doesn't have the heart to tell Chris that he's not really comforted at all. But
Right.
when he leaves, he has
Exactly.
this look on his face, kind of like, thanks, I guess. And he doesn't say
That's
anything.
serious. And
At least
Chris,
maybe I can check some of these things off at least. At least I know it's not these things.
Uh, I I
but
mean,
it does lead into callings and Jacob as a minister. Do you want to talk about a
sure.
calling, the way you felt it, and
Yeah, so just to kind of unpack a little bit more for our audience, if you haven't seen the episode, the Ed goes to 3 different people with this problem that he's experiencing. He goes to Chris, and Chris has kind of anecdotal suggestions from his experience that don't end up helping Ed. He can't figure out why he keeps waking up in these places. So he goes to Joel, and Joel can't find anything wrong with him physically and is recommending he gets a psychological evaluation, which doesn't really answer his question, but he leaves Joel. And then he talks with Leonard, the medicine man, the healer, and the shaman. And Leonard says, well, you're sleep flying. And is that right? And then
Mhm.
Ed's like, oh my goodness, yes, because when he uses that term sleep flying to Joel, Joel's like, "What are you talking about, Ed? You sound crazier than usual." But the shaman gets it that this idea of like waking up in high places, like the tree or the top of the store. So then he says, "Well, there's one test that we can do to before we make any assumptions about what's going on." And so he buries Ed's hand in the ground and has him sit there for a while, for quite a long time, and then he comes back and he digs Ed's hand out, and when Ed lifts his hand out, he's holding what are those things that he's holding? How
Roots.
roots. Yeah, and so he says, "Oh, Ed, this is a sign that you've been like called to be like a shaman or someone who helps
Mm.
others heal." And Ed's like very surprised because he's squeamish at the sight of blood. If somebody's going to throw up, he almost wants to has that gag reflex. Like there's a lot of things that would make him a not that ideal candidate for helping people through their sicknesses. So then the episode towards the end for him is like kind of wrestling with this question, like if I'm called to be a shaman, what does that mean? And how and so at the very end of the episode, I mean, just following his thread, then he realizes that it's a choice. Like, even though there's a calling, he can choose whether or not to do it. And actually, Leonard cautions him to weigh the decision carefully because there are a lot of costs for that type of calling because people all times of day are coming and have needs. So, anyway, with that being said, I'm going to rewind and engage Ken's question about calling because I could relate to the aspect of Ed's story where he was not anticipating the calling and where he kind of his first thoughts were about how maybe he was not suited or didn't feel like naturally matched for the calling. And in my pastoral ministry, I have talk with my colleagues about their stories and I have my own. That is not as a very uncommon experience. Actually, quite a few people go through that questioning phase where they question themselves, they question what they thought they would be doing, or some people in ministry or these different roles that the vocations that they're in feel that calling from a very early age, they have that clarity. But for some, it's kind of a gradual thing that emerges, and then for some, as we find out in Ed's story, there's that element of choice where they could do it, and then they have to kind of decide will they step into that or not. But for me, it was something that my grandmother on my mom's side when I was young used to tell me like, "Oh, I just have been praying and I hope someday you'll be a pastor." And at the time I thought, "Oh, that's nice. My grandma would, you know, like me to do something spiritual and she must think highly of me or be supportive of me in that specific way." And that felt good, but I didn't necessarily feel like, "Yes, this is what I'm to do." I just thought, "Oh, that's what my grandmother thinks." But then when I got into college, a lot of my friends as I was getting actually towards the end of graduating and I was applying to programs and things, they're like, you should really consider seminary because we sense that a lot of your spare time, you're thinking about faith and questions of theology and questions about the Bible. And it would be great to be a part of a community where you could learn and go deeper with that. And explore that for your like what's next in your life. And so I met with Katie's pastor from her home church. His name was Roger, and he was a very insightful person. And he listened to me, and he really encouraged me and affirmed that he was sensing too that there was some stirring there that seemed unnatural. But even still at that point, I was thinking maybe my calling was into academia, and so I thought, oh, I'll get a master's and then go on for a doctorate and try to become a professor, which I did do the master's and the doctorate. But right as I graduated, Worcester Mennonite Church needed an interim pastor, and I had served in ministry there as an assistant to the former pastor, and I had worked in youth ministry in other churches, so I knew some about church ministry. So said, "Yes, I'll step into that role," and I loved it. And then they called me as the full time pastor. But I don't know if you're sensing from what I'm saying, but there was an element of my story of discovery because I thought I was maybe going to be in academia. I didn't necessarily know that pastoral ministry would be such a good fit for me. But then, like once I entered that role, it was so meaningful, and I really enjoyed it and have felt very fulfilled there. So, anyway, all that to say, in my story, there was an element of surprise to calling, kind of like how we find Ed in this episode, like surprised, maybe not quite as surprised as him, like out of the blue, like in that sense, like there were stepping stones along the way that were heading maybe in that direction slightly, but I think that calling does it can very much involve doubt and introspection and self-reflection. And is this for me? And I guess we're going to find out in future episodes where that leads Ed, and if he ultimately says no. And but anyway, one last thing I'll say about that is you have the individual journey that each person has to go on when they are discerning their big life questions and decisions. But then I think there is a communal aspect where people come around you. And that's what I was trying to get at a little bit in my story, that there were people who came alongside me and helped me reflect and think about things in a different way. And I think that's a very helpful piece. And then ultimately, from a faith perspective, I think there needs to be a spiritual dimension of calling where you sense God's direction or leading as you discern that. And those elements were really important for me. So yeah, those are some thoughts I have about calling. As I was sharing that, does it elicit anything from your end, or to either of you, does it kind of resonate with some of your experiences? Or
I was going as you when you started, I came up with maybe a follow-up question, but you actually kind of ended up answering it the more that as you went on. And because I was thinking at the beginning of the episode, Ed has a lot of like arrows, like a lot of things like pointing out, you're sleep flying. Well, why are you sleep flying? You've been sleep flying a few times. Well, it must be most likely that you're a shaman. And I was wondering if you had some kind of signposts, things like that, arrows pointing in a direction. But as you explained it, it seemed like you too really had, with different people pointing things out. Well, that they noticed kind of in your life, they noticed, wow, you really might be in a direction headed for at least seminary. And
yeah,
so it seemed like you too, like there are a few different ways we could see overlapping between, Ed's humorous fictional story and the way that probably it works for, I mean, in your case, and then also in a lot of people's cases, I think, when they're being called to some vocation or something else in their lives.
that's a good point, Barney. And some people do have a almost a profound religious experience or some like circumstance emerge that seems like a very much a confirmation or an outward sign of callings. For some people, that is definitely a part of their journey. And I come from a religious tradition. We talked about this a little bit last time when we were talked about music, but from the charismatic stream of Christian faith, which has a lot of emphasis on outward signs and experiences. So I have had a number of those over the years that have kind of been kind of encouraged me in my faith or helped me sense God at work in my life. Interestingly enough, around this area of calling, I've kind of come to understand that some of my like struggles in life have been kind of prepared me a little bit for my role in ministry. And I've kind of come to learn that each of us, when we've had to work through something on our own, sometimes it gives us more empathy and ability to connect with other people who are going through similar things. So for example, I really struggled with academics when I was a student. And so my parents, in order to try to help me like kind of break out of patterns and break out of the box of being stuck, they actually ha- moved me to different schools a variety of times. I was in like 4 different schools from kindergarten through 12th grade. And that experience of being a new person and going in and not having like a lot of social credibility and then trying to get established and build friendships again, starting over has made me a lot more sensitive to people who are at the margins of a community or who are visiting or outsiders. And I think that I'm so grateful I had those experiences. So what I'm trying to say is that there are some probably experiences like in my own journey or other people's lives that are more how do I say, unique and momentary. And then there's some like broader life issues that they've gone through that actually profoundly shape their calling or the profession they'll be in and trying to help other people or have empathy. And so, yeah, that's was part of my calling. And it would be interesting to think about Ed from that standpoint. I mean, I don't know like some of his experiences, how they would shape him as a potential person who would help others. I'm sure that one we could probably parse that out. But anyway, I don't know if that makes sense. So my calling is both like there were moments and definitely from that charismatic imagination that I was formed in me growing up, I could sense God at work kind of affirming me. There's the community that came around me. There was the sense of a purpose, but then there were some like deeper struggles or parts of my experience that shaped who I am that flow well or fit well in a ministry context and kind of are areas that I minister out of now. I don't know if that makes sense. So,
Well,
yeah.
I'm wondering, Jacob, like Barney, you think of these follow-up questions because it's a fascinating story. Were you issued within seminary cautionary words akin to what Leonard brought to Ed to say, now, you know, things to consider here, high divorce rate. I was not around for my kids. Because being a minister, looking at it from the outside, not only is it difficult because of the expectations sometimes placed upon you, upon ministers, difficult for your wife, Katie, to be in the position of minister's wife. And I'm not just singling out
Yeah.
Katie. I'm
Right.
looking in my own family, we have a Lutheran minister
Oh,
and
yeah.
his wife and how there were struggles.
Yeah. You're 100% right that there are a lot of unique pressures for the family members of somebody who's a clergy person in, yeah, for their spouse, for their children, the expectations that a community can have for those people, for how they behave and how they can feel scrutinized as they're, just going through their lives alongside the clergy person. So yeah, I actually was warned about those things in seminary. We, the ministry related courses that I took would talk about self care, having a healthy rhythm for like retreat, Sabbath, personal space, and making sure that individuals know that they have to tend to their own physical, mental, and spiritual health in order to be in a good place to serve the congregations that they're with and to serve the emotional, mental, spiritual health of those individuals. The clergy person has to be in a good place themselves. And then also some of the unique pressures that can happen when you have a community they're discerning really important questions to people that often things that we're passionate about with our faith are very near and dear to our heart. And so emotions can run high if there's disagreements or tensions. So yeah, definitely a lot of warnings about that in seminary, which made me reticent and was maybe partly the reason I was leaning more towards academia because I thought, oh, like there are unique pressures for a professor. They have to publish and they have to get tenure and they have to, you know, kind of keep staying relevant in their field. But I felt that weight, that type of what you were describing, Ken, of that this I don't know if you want to call it the social spiritual pressure that could be on me and my family had discouraged me. But interestingly enough, being a part of Worcester Mennonite Church just as members, well, I did serve as Ralph's assistant for a time, but then after that position ended, Katie was working at the OARDC and I was writing my dissertation and we were just attending as members. It kind of diffused some of that fear because people were already used to seeing us as just another part of the congregation. So when it came time for the calling of an interim pastor, I felt like, oh, I could serve in this congregation without feeling a real intense sense of pressure. So it was a lot easier for me to feel comfortable imagining that and then to step into that. And it's been easier ever since because there hasn't been. Katie's told me on numerous occasions because she was a part of the congregation before I started as the pastor that she felt like those relationships were already established on that kind of friendship basis with other members of the congregation. So she hasn't had that struggle. And I think in general, my kids have felt pretty unencumbered or free in how they could be themselves in the congregation and haven't, you know, felt that was a burden. But if it had been a different situation and a congregation was calling me that I didn't know, I would that would have been more intimidating. Does that get at your question?
Mhm.
Yeah.
For
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in contrast to you, Ed has at times so little self-worth and feelings of
Mhm.
confidence and I don't wanna issue spoilers for you, Jacob, as to what is yet to come, but your speculation has been spot on.
Yeah, just to stick with this topic a little bit because it is so fascinating. We kind of get a little bit of some clarity in the tools that shamans use. I think Leonard kind of alludes to them a little bit, like primarily, poultices and whatnot, kind of traditional medicine. But he also relies a lot on healing stories. And there's another episode where he comes to Sicily to try to understand, what is the Caucasian, what is the Western idea, I guess the Western idea of healing stories. I mean, I said Caucasian because he actually says, the white person's story, but the Western idea of healing stories, and we see Ed too using his healing stories end up being movies, and then as I was watching that and thinking of these questions and the one that I ended up writing, I thought, what are some of the tools that pastors end up using? Because you mentioned that in terms of spiritual, you mentioned spiritual and emotional and mental well-being that you occasionally have to help the people in the church and attend to. And I thought, what are maybe some of the pastors or your specific kind of go-to tools that you
Yeah.
are able to rely on and find the most helpful for the people that you're working with?
Yeah, that's a great question, Barney. So if each of those needs, the spiritual, the emotional, the physical, can correspond to aspects of pastoral ministry. And so probably the most immediate one is praying with people who are going through difficult times. Like as a pastor, the spiritual need there is something that I feel is close to like what people would expect from me to do. And so that's naturally where I would start. So if a family is going through loss, there've been a number of times that I met with a family and we've prayed together, or if somebody's in the hospital, I'm able to visit them and to pray with them. And there's such a spiritual dimension to prayer. It's this kind of joining together in the presence of God and listening and voicing hope and lamenting sometimes and sitting with that, or in sometimes prayers of celebration if it's a joyful time, entering into that with a person. But and then in addition to that spiritual aspect, there is the area of pastoral counseling, which is for me largely listening and encouraging. I don't have formal training in counseling, and so I can't diagnose, or I don't have all the tools that a counselor would have. So I would, if something is serious and it would require meeting with a counselor, I would definitely encourage somebody to do that. But a lot of times people that I meet with just want to be listened to and to be encouraged. And so most of the time that is how I would try to serve them. And the physical needs come in the compassion fund that our church has. So there are individuals that reach out to our church, or even members of our church at times that are going through something difficult, and we can come alongside and provide some resources so that they can have their physical needs met, bills, other things that are needed equipment, like things that can help, like that it help them through a difficult situation or help improve their life. So I feel like the goal is to minister holistically to each person because God cares about all aspects of who we are. I believe that really deeply. I think that's core to the gospel message. And so then as a pastor, I want to have ways to reach people in wherever their needs are and in those different areas. And so that's what I try to do. Yes.
Well, given your effectiveness in these areas, and I can speak to it because I've been with you 12 or 13 years now and witness it. And I don't know if this is a put you on the spot kind of question, but it's more speculative, Jacob. Given the fact that your initial thought was to perhaps seek a professorship and teach, have you ever thought of not leaving the ministry, but perhaps in addition, there's still in my mind, I think I have some things to offer academically, maybe teaching a course or and not even affiliated with a university. Some of the things you just mentioned, how to compassionately deal with people who are in troubling times. Are those thoughts
Yeah,
passing through your being?
for sure. For sure. Thanks, Ken. So when I first started at Worcester Mennonite, that first year when I was serving as interim, I had the opportunity to adjunct a course with Ohio Christian University on the theology of Christian experience, is what it was called. And I really enjoyed that. But then it was very hectic to be preparing lessons and also to be pastoring at the same time. And so that was quite intense. And I was able to do it for that one quarter that I taught that course. But I thought to myself, wow, I would have to like kind of communicate with my leadership team and make sure if I did that again, I was in a season that was a little lighter or something like that, ministry wise. But I love the experience. But then to answer your question, I think in a deeper way, there are lots of aspects of pastoral ministry where there are teaching opportunities where you can engage a complex topic and go deep with it. And it gets at that same heart that like I think an academic person would love to how they would like to engage. And so, for example, a few years ago, oh boy, actually more than a few, probably like 7 years ago or 8 years ago, I did for a short time, a theology reading group. And, Kathy Schmid, Cindy Bay, I think there was Latricia Mitchell, maybe a student at the time. There were several other people who came, and there was Alistair McGrath has this Christian theology reader, and he has short little snippets of significant theological works, and he gives an intro for each one, and then a reflection questions at the end. And so we'd pick one of those each week, and so that was an academic type thing that I was able to do. But then, like on a deeper level, sorry, I'm going on and on. I'll try to bring this to a close. There have been needs that have emerged within the community that I'm not necessarily like addressing with a study, but there are like intuitive things that an academically minded person would do in terms of creating conversation or dialogue around certain things that in the classroom you get that space that in life you don't always have that opportunity, a safe place to work through a challenging issue. And particularly in our culture right now where things can be very polarized, there isn't always that space for dialogue. So our church went through this, I think it was around 2014, and you were there for this, Ken. And I don't know, Barney, to what extent you were hearing about this from Japan, but we had this very challenging time in our denomination around the topic of human sexuality. And a lot of congregations were reacting to that in different ways. And our church tried to really dig deep into understanding one another and the reasons for why we hold the positions that we do. So we did this whole series called Reasoning Together, and we used a book written by two Mennonite scholars, Mark Thiessen Nation and Ted Grimsrud, I believe is his name, something like that. Anyway, and that helped guide us through this process of conversation and listening. And I felt like that was a very deeply pastoral time and rich time for us as a community to listen. It was hard, but it was a time for us to draw close together during a challenging period. But like also part of that, the vision for that is that kind of academic impulse to understand, to go deeper in how we understand others and how we understand ourselves and build bridges between you know, those gaps between people and groups. And so, anyway, I don't know. That was a time that stands out to me where that part of myself felt fulfilled. So, I don't know if that answers your question. So, yes, there have been times throughout the years where it's not necessarily like a formal class or something, but the, that academic journey, that part it undergirds something I'm doing in ministry, and then there still are lovely opportunities to go to a convention or to present a paper or to still write. Like in the summer of 2023, which was my 20th anniversary with Katie, I was able to go to a conference in Scotland. And that's because I was able to submit an article for the St. Andrew's Encyclopedia of Theology. And that's something I was able to still write while I was a pastor, on my free time. So still have academic outlets, so yeah.
So,
Yeah. Are there any other aspects of Ed's story that we want to talk about in terms of his journey, or do we feel like we should transition now to other parts of the?
Yeah, I was thinking that we kind of would be in a good spot maybe to see pick up maybe Shelley's thread here,
Mm.
because like she and Ed really connect there at the moment when he is seen if he's being called. So at the end of season 4, Sh- Shelley, and I wonder how the actor Cynthia Geary, I wonder how she felt when she got her script and said, "You're going to be singing this entire episode." So I don't know what her background is, but of course, if she does a great job in season 4, the finale, she sings some fun songs and sings it in a great way. And she and Holling work through that because Holling gets a little bit, well, he likes a variety. He doesn't want to have to hear singing for every answer to his questions, that he might have. But in the end, he says, we'll learn to harmonize, and then they finish season 4 with them singing together, and then now season 5, she's still singing, and probably us as viewers are thinking, oh boy, how many you know, is this going to be? Because it does kind of disrupt the flow of the show to have only one person singing.
Yeah.
How long it's going to, and it's so funny how when it ends, when it's time to sing happy birthday to Lowell Gripple, he's turning 55, and if anyone's going to sing happy birthday, it's going to be Shelley. And then just the best piece of TV, ever, when she's intentionally singing so poorly. Just the worst kind of singing ever.
Monotone.
I know. And then really flat and just great. Yeah. And then from there, we see that she's actually worried now. In season 4, she's wondering, why am I singing? And now she's singing, why am I not singing? And yeah, she gets different people's, reactions as well, and I think when she ends up at where Ed is because Leonard said, I'll have someone bring you some food. So she comes and brings Ed the food, and then she realizes that Ed didn't point out the fact that she's not singing anymore, and that helps them on their initial discussion here, and we get a little bit of insight to how Ed might be as a shaman. And what did you guys think of Ed's advice, or what Ed ended up saying to her?
I kind of thought it was the first little lean Ed was showing towards perhaps being self-confident enough to maybe I could do this shaman thing by saying, I think I could help you, Shelley. I think I can help you. And yeah, it added to the poignancy of the scene as well. Because Ed is definitely going to be a good guy to go to, and Ed is definitely going to be the guy that, Leonard said, one of the first things you have to do, Ed, is learn to know the patient and spend time. You may have to spend 4 or 5 days with the person. We can see Ed willing to do that for Shelley right then. So a really nice touch in bringing this episode to some closure for Shelley, because like you said, Barney, I was certainly wondering the first time through the program, is she going to sing? Because it is grating at times, and even though her voice is pleasant enough, ooh, when's enough? But the writers did a nice job of bringing closure to that. Jacob, as always, we look at you, a first-time viewer, to say,
Yeah.
how is all this sitting?
Well, I agree with Barney that it felt like when Ed was giving some feedback for Shelley, he was trying to step into that role of being a supporter, but he's gotten the first step of relating to the patient. Like he's selected a story that is parallel to hers that drew her in and captured her attention. But he hasn't selected an example that has a happy ending or is redemptive or helpful. He's selected a story that is actually going to leave his patient feeling worse. So he's got the first step. Okay, I found something from my memory bank that I could say that connects with their story. But then he has to ask the second question beyond that. Is this story that I'm going to share ultimately going to be helpful for them? And like there might maybe he'd have to find another story that had something that would move her beyond just the place of feeling over overwhelmed or sad or so but it's Ed is this is also new to Ed. Like I think Leonard says, you wouldn't expect a first year medical student to do an advanced medical procedure. It takes time to hone these types of listening skills. And but yeah, I found that interesting, their conversation. And very sweet. She obviously was thoughtful and bringing the food to him, and he wanted to help. The intent was good. He so
Yeah. And for them to integrate Ed being the movie buff that he is, to integrate the movie Awakenings as he's talking to Shelley, bang, bang, bang.
yes,
The-
I thought that was perfect. I really liked the way that they set up the scene where it's such beautiful nature and then they're facing each other, looking at each other. We're looking at them from the side instead of like switching, head on perspective. And you see a real friendship, a real camaraderie between them, real mutual respect between them. And yeah, Ed really tried. And we do see that, wow, this maybe the Western healing stories, maybe they are movies, and yeah, Ed would be the person to go to. And I think this is another thing where he probably realized, well, I mean, even though this really falls flat, I mean, he probably realized, maybe my healing stories that I can help bridge, reach the people who come to me are movies. And we kind of see that Ed could be this bridge between the traditional idea of what a shaman is and the Western world because he has, he himself has a Western parent. His mom was, they said his mom was a teacher from wherever, she's white. And then his dad was from, one of the, I mean, Salmon clan, I think, or Bear clan, I think. And then so he is himself in those two worlds. And so he can be a bridge between them. But then finally we see back with Shelley's story, we see some real perspective where we see, how does an expert shaman handle this? And I like how that scene opens up where Shelley is, walking down the street by herself, singing so poorly again. And then Leonard says, boy, that's bad.
which right away then spurred the red green thing in my mind, Barney, because he did it with the same face, even though he had kind of a sheepish grin. He did it with the same face he does drama, and it's hilarious. Yeah, that was terrible, Shelley. Yeah, but go on. I'm sorry.
Yeah, how
Uh,
did you guys enjoy? What did you guys think that he was going to say, and then how did you end up? How did you appreciate how that ended up? His advice ended up being. What did you guys think of that?
I felt like it was so masterful how he brought her through the journey of singing and then not being able to sing as a way to shift it to her understanding of fear and then feeling like things were okay. I mean, boy, oh boy, did he really understand the deeper struggles she had and helped her get in touch with that and realize that it's a good thing that she's no longer singing everything because now she's in a place where she doesn't need to do that anymore because things are okay. She feels grounded and her baby's going to be okay. And then that opens the door for the ending of the episode with her just kind of being at peace, preparing things in the home for the child. And yeah, so I think maybe the episode's showing us what a healthy example of somebody who is a healer, how they function, and yeah, what did you think, Ken?
Yeah, I can't say much more to that, Jacob. I was certainly hoping. I'm trying to remember the first time I watched. I was hoping that Leonard would be supportive and figured he probably would be. And the writers, I thought, did well with saying you don't have to worry any longer. And I always look at the family unit of Shelley and Holling, which an outside viewer would find to be unusual at best. But Holling always gives Shelley space, always, always, always an understanding. Her world is so different from his in so many ways. But the singing, even though he grimaced at times, let's let it be Shelley's thing, and so many things that Shelley is experiencing for the first time as a young woman that Holly can look at and say, this too shall pass, and I care for her enough to let it be. And watching her then in the end that you alluded to about putting up the safety devices, when Holling have done it, doesn't really matter. He's again giving Shelley the opportunity for space and happiness and feelings of this this little pooper is going to be okay.
I love how they always call it the pooper. Yeah. What I liked so much about that is it's incredibly believable what and Leonard's advice and Leonard's diagnosis of why she was singing. When you hear the way he explains, you think that makes perfect sense. And then when he also equates it to, why might someone, whistle when they go past the graveyard? Yeah, it's just a way of dealing with fears. And then you think that really it is very it makes perfect sense. It's so relatable. And I forgot to I wanted to ask my wife, did she have any weird dreams, of what the baby was going to turn up to be like a fish or something like that that Shelley mentions. But yeah, there must I mean, even though especially even this day and age when we're able to get to the doctor and, stay informed and, we understand a lot more of what's happening during the pregnancy and get checked in, and checked out and monitor the health of the baby that's growing, there still is that bit of, underlying worry. It's such a big event and a lot could happen. And, there's a lot of reasons for the father to be worried, but especially the mom. And then relating that to, why was she doing such a weird thing of singing, and it's her way of coping. And it's so neat the way they have Leonard point that out. And I liked that a lot. That was great. That was really a great way to explain because we didn't know why she was singing in season 4 or the finale. They never said why. It's just this is her thing, and then explaining why she was singing, and then now why she's not singing, and helping her to feel better about the fact that she's not doesn't need to sing anymore. And then, of course, Leonard says, "If you really are worried about your singing voice, like my my niece or my aunt or someone is a singing teacher, you can contact her."
Yes, lessons. Again, Barney, I think that's so much of the magic of this series. The whole singing episode, it could have been passed off as a quirk of Shelley, and now she's pregnant, so she's even quirkier. And the next season starts, and we never hear about it again. A lot of TV shows would do that, but the continuity of let's not just let this pass. You know, is it time to get into Joel a bit? Where we won't dismiss Leonard because he was there in part for that as well, but Joel and his experience with glacier dropsy. Wow. Jacob, as you saw Joel looking like something's not right, what were you thinking as the disease became apparent?
I just feel like this is another case in point of his adversarial relationship with like local knowledge or like home remedies, and he wants to apply his scientific knowledge to every aspect of life in Sicily, and especially with this sickness that's coming upon him. He just can't bear to consider advice from locals. He can only sift what he's experiencing through what he's learned at medical school. And so, yeah, that's that tension, that really, I mean, I understand on one level, like for a medical professional, he feels like he needs to uphold a certain standard. He doesn't want to be superstitious and, put trust in the wrong thing. But on the other hand, he has quite at times, how do I want to say it? Condescending attitude towards the local knowledge. He just seems to look down at what the suggestions that people are giving him, even though they're really trying to help him and they're sincerely trying to offer him something that has helped them and their own experience. But so it felt like consistent with things we've seen from him in the past, but it takes it to a whole new level. When you see him get in his truck and drive down the road and then like veer off and wreck into some, I don't know if it was some metal container or something. And then, then they get him into bed. But I liked how the town you know, was kind of nurturing and taking care of their doctor. It was like the tables were turned, and now they were the ones that were the caregivers, and they took shifts. And even Chris in the radio station was giving regular updates on how Dr. Fleischman was coming along and how he was progressing. And so I just thought that was fantastic that they could be in the role of being his caregiver. Although he was a difficult patient, he rarely would just receive, what they would do. He would take off the wraps that they put on him, and he would be, kind of pointed in what he'd say, but especially to Maggie. But yeah, but it was good. What do you guys think of that part of the plot?
Well, his behavior is certainly not unexpected. Barney, I'll yield to you here for your introspection.
Yeah, it really did, like Jacob, you got it exactly right, where he so often tries to explain everything through that lens of his medical knowledge. And yeah, he thought he could heal it. And I liked the scene in the brick where, Holling kind of is alerted and Ruth Ann to what might be happening. And they go, ooh, ooh. So you say the thought of shrimp makes you sick. And he's like, stop talking about shrimp or I'm going to throw up. And then, oh, it's glacier dropsy, you've got the ague, and, but he won't believe anybody. He won't believe them at all. And I like that everyone's so understanding. And then I like how he asks, it was either Holling or Maurice, has anyone died from this before? When he's in such pain, and they say, oh, you know, oh, not in the past 8 or 7 or 8 years, at least.
And you mentioned Ruth Ann. I like how they tied together early on. Ruth Ann says the only thing more painful than what you're going to experience, Joel, is childbirth. And then for our viewers, later on, there's a scene where Joel is fully engaged in glacial dropsy, and they portray Joel as being pregnant, giving birth, and Ruth Ann is there. And I'm just thinking, you people, you know how to write. And Joel is just screaming in agony. And you hate to laugh, but wow. Do you believe it yet, Joel?
And
Oh,
then there's that funny moment where the physician colleague calls him back and gives him the same advice that he had thought himself previously about the situation. And he's like, no, it's not that because I have this symptom in my nose. I already tried that, particular drug and it did make a difference. So he gets to see, and I kind of partly in a hallucination, I think of his friend. He's picturing a conversation with him, but then his friend had called. But he gets to see what it's like when somebody won't validate your experience. Like they just keep telling you what the analytical like outcome that they think based on. And Joel had already been there, and I don't know. Maybe some of his patients feel like that. Some, when he'll just. But anyway, it was a kind of interesting moment for Joel to be kind of like confronted with his own. I don't know what you would call it, his own attitude surrounding diagnosing sickness, and he didn't like it. He's like, "What was the phrase you said? Don't what me? What was the
QID.
QID?" Yeah.
Why do you think they had Neil in the hallucination at the park? Why do you think they had him as a bicycle? He has his bicycle garb on and he's got the bike with him. I thought
Was
about it. I can't.
was it because it was his day off? He said, "Joel, what are you doing? Contacting me on my day
Okay.
off." And he
Mhm.
was out like
Okay.
biking and doing fun stuff. And Joel has these medical questions. That was my thought.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh
Y
man.
I think that this I think that the writers and everyone had a real image of the path that they wanted season 5 to take, and I mean, of course, later in the future, especially season 6, we find out that, things that are happening in real life kind of made things take a different path, but I think that they had a real path set up for how they wanted season 5 to take the story, especially of Joel. And I think, Jacob, you really tapped into something important that I didn't realize, where Joel has the chance to feel what it's like, what he's been doing to basically everybody in one way or one form or another, when he realizes what it's like when someone is not listening to him. What it feels like to not be listened to by an expert or someone who thinks that they're such an expert. And that's what he has, did a bunch in this episode, and it has done a number of times in the past. And I think that that kind of I think we can see that as a wake up for Joel. And then another big thing that really happened a bunch is how really, really mean he was to Maggie. Probably some of it, I'm sure he would have filtered it a bit if it hadn't been the fever. But we've seen in this 4 full seasons up to now, that he can be pretty caustic to her. But she didn't respond in kind, as she may have in the past, for sure. And then she explains later why she didn't. But how did you feel about this this kind of new slant on their new look into their relationship when you saw them together in this scene when he's mad, and then also later when he kind of sincerely apologizes to her?
Jacob?
Yeah, I feel like she's being very gracious by saying so he just for our audience, if you haven't seen the episode, at one point, Joel wants an aspirin, and she won't give it to him because somebody else who had this dropsy took an aspirin and it made their tongue swell up, but he doesn't wanna hear it, he just wants it, and so she won't give it to him, so he calls her all these names, basically calling her stupid and dumb, and then later, when she comes back and he's feeling better, she's brought him lunch, and he wants to apologize to her, and she explains, "Well, I've chosen to forget that because I don't just wanna fight with you all the time," and then he does apologize, and so I felt like she was being gracious, but I don't it would be hard for me to imagine going through a relationship permanently with that posture where you just choose to keep forgetting if somebody says terribly mean things to you, and then, well, I'll choose to forget that and we'll move forward. I think at some point, I mean, maybe some personalities could do that. They have such a fortitude and it wouldn't build up emotionally for them. But for me, to not address and not, if it were a pattern of behavior over time, I think that could be unhealthy. But I guess maybe in this particular case, she's also factoring in, he wasn't in his right mind. He was kind of acting out of desperation and, it kind of magnified the worst of his qualities when he was name calling her that he was, had a fever and was, so she gives him the benefit of the doubt. So probably in this case, if it's just a one off, that was gracious of her and it was good that he apologized to her. But I wouldn't want to see that happen a lot in the future and her to keep taking that approach because that would kind of enable if somebody were behaving that way, that could enable their bad behavior. And it could be kind of abusive, to keep saying those things whenever they're upset. And then the person like just takes it. But no, in this case, it was very gracious of her. And I'm glad that he apologized and that their relationship seems to be in a good place at the end of the episode. So yeah. What did you think, Ken?
I was wondering, as she walks in at the end, is she being dutiful because you bring food and stuff to sick people? I was curious what feeling we would get from her, but she was being gracious, and I mean she did walk out. She could only take so much of Stupid and Dalton, and she did walk out, and yet she comes back graciously, genuinely concerned about his recovery and that he is doing well. She doesn't bring up what happened, which is another mark in her favor. But one must be led to believe that at some point it's got to be Joel learning how to conduct a relationship properly, because bang, 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 so many times, and there's usually an apology, but how do you conduct a relationship of any substance in an ongoing way? Hmm,
Hmm.
I guess we'll see.
Yeah, it's nice how they. I think this is probably just something that would. I wonder if the writers felt that this is something that would kind of naturally eventually happen. Like it's kind of hard to get a sense of how much time has passed since the pilot, because initially he's just supposed to be there for 4 years. And so it kind of feels like, well, it's one season a year, or has it just been, a few months over the course of a season? But anyway, by now we can see that, having different experiences with the same people and in such a small town, and, not being able to, retreat back to New York, a few times a year, because he often doesn't get his vacation. He sometimes gets denied, because there's no one to take his place. But, eventually, you would begin to soften. And it feels like it's not something that has starkly, it's not, oh, wow, they're best friends now. It feels like it has organically happened. And yeah, there's still a long ways. It's still very bumpy, but at least Joel is kind of becoming aware of himself a little bit more and the people around him, and stop. And it's maybe thinking, maybe he doesn't have to think of himself exclusively as a New Yorker and everyone else around him is just some bumpkin. He can finally kind of see the humanity in the people that, and the worth and the value in the people that have been with him. And I think that this really cements that, as they cared so much about him and they helped him so much. They could have just left him to his own devices, or, thought, well, eventually it's going to run its course. He'll get better after a few days anyway, no matter what we do. But they really did care, even though there wasn't much that they could do aside from show him that they were caring. And I think that kind of is one of the themes that they wanted to set up in season 5. And the finale to season 5 is great. And you're left to think, if things had gone differently, wow, what season 6 could have been like. But we'll talk about that eventually, I think.
Sure. And how perfect it was when we know that his recovery is going to be complete and he will be well again.
Mhm.
Let's have Marilyn be the one to say, it's time to get on with life. It's time to get up. And then she just has that look that she has, and she just stands there. I don't know if I. It's time to get up,
Yeah. Yeah.
man.
Hmm.
You saw it, didn't you? You saw it, Joel, didn't you? The glacier. Ah, come to think about it, I had this dream. A field of ice. Yeah,
Now
great
we know
stuff.
now we know why it's called glacier dropsy, but isn't it so interesting the way that they wrote this disease that when you're not finally cured until you see the glacier.
Wonderful.
Mhm.
If I
Good.
may, I wanted to transition to one other piece of the episode, unless if there's more to say in this point, if that's okay. During Chris in the mornings routine, he talked about Sicily's continuing education program, and he said, and there'll be a class on practical rural law being taught by Lou Volpe, and it will address issues of roadkill and whose moose is it. And Lou Volpe was an English teacher at Wheeling Central Catholic High School, where I went, where John Corbin went. The person who plays Chris, he was my English teacher, and it's just so interesting because he's been a lifelong presence in my life. Because when I was getting ordained in the Mennonite Church, I asked if he would be one of my mentor figures during that process, and he was. He's Catholic, but he's a very spiritual person, and he walked alongside me during those years when I was heading towards ordination. He would meet with me and process things, and it was so helpful because that was a time in my life when had lost my parents, and he was there as a support through that. And but anyway, I just thought it was great that he managed to work in the name of one of his former teachers into the dialogue there about Sicily's continuing education program. I just had to say something about it. So yeah, shout out to you, Lou Volpe.
Yay.
That must have been so neat. And I saw an article where, I'm sorry, what's his
So
first name?
John?
John Corbin, where he mentions how much of an impact Lou Volpe had on him in his life when he was there. And then in other episodes, at least one other episode, Chris mentions the warden of the jail where he stayed, and it was Warden Viglietta. And I
Oh,
think he
Doc
said that was the
Viglietta,
principal.
the
Yes.
principal, yes. Oh my goodness.
Uh,
That's
uh,
awesome. Yes. And it's so funny that he would mention him as the warden because he was a very
Yeah.
jovial person in real life. Like he would smile and laugh. But yeah, he was the principal. He could be firm if he needed to be, but that's funny imagining him as a warden. But just a shout out to our listeners. If you're a newer listener, we did 2 earlier episodes that kind of delve into some of this territory. One was called, I think it's called something like The Power of Mentoring or something like that. It's about mentors and talk about my time with Lou Volpe in that one. And then we did another episode called Wheeling Central Catholic High School, which is all about Central Catholic. So if you want any more information about those topics, you can check out those episodes. Yeah.
Mhm.
Glad you brought that up.
Thank
So
you.
neat. Yeah, that's so neat. I didn't catch that. And any final thoughts or questions or topics from you guys before we wrap it up?
Good.
Yeah, we want to thank all of you again for spending a nice moment with us today as we looked at season 5, episode 1 of Northern Exposure, The Three Doctors. And we hope that this gives you inspiration to check out the series if you haven't, or watch it again. I can't say how many times I've watched these episodes, but I always notice something new. And then, especially talking with Ken and Jacob, I really gain new thoughts and ideas and insights into the show. I just happened to see the other day how I think it was even Barry Corbin, maybe I can't remember his name, the person who played Maurice. It was Adam Arkin, who was Adam, and then also directed a number of episodes. He was saying how he's never been a part of a better show. He thought that was the best TV that there could be at that time, and it really something magical about this episode, or that this series, this show. And we hope that you maybe if you haven't seen it, you want to check it out yourself. But anyway, as for our show, the Two World Podcast, we want to thank you all for taking time to be with us today, and we hope that you, as we are looking forward to the next episode of the Two World Podcast. And so, for Ken and Jacob, I am Barney, and we will see you guys again next time.